Thank you, Scott. Thanks, everybody. All right, so my clicker, I got my weapons in front of me here. All right, well, thanks. We did a lot of the introduction there, and I did a little bit of this in the beginning. As Professor Hengstrom said, I sat where you are sitting. I think they changed the chair since then, but the same room. I started sitting in this room. Next year, it'll be 40 years ago that I was sitting in this room. So Jennifer was asking me, she goes, I think you're familiar with the campus. I said, yeah, but it's changed a few times over the 40 years I've been coming here. So just wanted to talk a little bit. I connected with some of you before we started. So I heard majors here of biochemistry, art, biology, wildlife. What other majors are here today? I'd like to know who you are. Just call it out. Anything else? Huh? Fisheries, okay. Others? Huh? Okay. Others? So how many are here because it fulfills some general requirement? Thank you. Thank you for being here. I'll try not to be, boring, and I'll try to actually make it interesting and not just a requirement today. So, as already noted, I'm also a pointer, and this was just a little map of some of my life. I grew up in Wisconsin and Illinois, and came to Stevens Point, and then, as Scott said, it went on to Missouri. But my graduate research was in Alaska, so I spent 3 years studying the system up there, and I'll talk about that a little bit today. And then I went from the Arctic Circle to the other end of the continent, to South Florida, and spent 8 years there before coming back to Wisconsin. At that point, I was married and had a couple kids, and we wanted to be back here by family. So that's a little bit of where I've been. I've worked and visited a couple other places in between, but excuse me. How am I doing with this one? Can anybody tell me, is it too much, or I don't know who's monitoring this thing for the people online? Okay. I don't want to, I know I do a lot of speaking with a microphone, and sometimes I get it too close and I'm obnoxiously loud. So I'm okay. All right, very good. So I like to share this a little bit because sometimes when you're, at your stage in life, you kind of like to know where people came from and how they got to where they're going. And so this is kind of my work history right there. I started out, the first real job I had, I was 14 years old and I was a janitor. And that's what I did all through high school, saving money for college. And then during college, I was a waiter for a couple of summers. And then my daughter would tell me they're called servers now. And then I did internships while I was here. I highly recommend doing whatever your field is, getting out and actually engaging in it in the professional world while you're here, to figure out whether that's really what you want to do, right? Dip your toes in the water and actually see, do I really want to do this? I highly recommend that. And then my master's degree, and then I was a wildlife manager. And then I became a regional land manager in Florida, where I supervised people doing a variety of things, from forest fire control to park management, to habitat and wildlife. And then when I came back to Wisconsin, I stepped into sort of a policy arena for public lands and dealt with all kinds of fun, controversial issues, whether like ATV trails and clear cutting and things that people had very strong opinions about, and had fun running public meetings where people wanted to kill me because I was trying to manage us down the middle. And then I was a state waterfall biologist. I came back to my beginning, and I did that for 12 years. And then I had a brief stint as a field supervisor again, and then became the chief of the bird and habitat programs. And I supervised 13 great people that all ran statewide programs for the last 4 years until July. And just kind of a little parallel world there. just so you know where I am now. So I was 27 years old when, I had an experience with the Lord, and he made some changes in my life. And it was a couple of years after that I also began working in ministry. So as noted earlier, I was talking about the undecided people. I've been undecided, my whole life. I've worked 2 careers, so because I couldn't decide. So I did 2 at the same time. And so I worked full-time in conservation and part-time in ministry. And then, so I actually didn't retire in July. I just switched careers. So now I'm doing full-time ministry and part-time conservation. So I'm glad I have the opportunity to kind of do a little bit of this that I did for the last 34 years here. And I've really enjoyed it. As I was mentioned earlier, as we were chatting, I've been back here 2 or 3 times, usually a semester, since I moved back to Wisconsin 23 years ago. And I always enjoy the opportunity to connect back with you all and my roots. I just want to make a plug for liberal arts education and some of the other coursework. As you can see, I've done a variety of things in my life and had parallel careers. And in the world of conservation, as I'm here now and I look back to where you are now, there were things that I did here, the coursework that I took that wasn't in the College of Natural Resources or wasn't in my major, that turned out to be really valuable. I took, for example, a history course in the history of Native Americans. And man, in my career later, that was hugely valuable. I never, didn't realize it, whenever I was 20 years old or when I took it, but those things are important. I remember taking an English class, and after I had always grown up loving the outdoors and appreciating the natural world, and then then I became, a student of science, and I'm learning all the details of the science. And sometimes you forget when you're doing that, just the beauty of it all. And I remember being challenged to write a poem for this English class, and I was able to go up to our family cabin and sit and look at the fall leaves and write a poem about leaves. And it just helped me to just broaden the way I looked at the world and the way I understood people that engage with the natural world. So plug for that. Don't take all those other courses just because you have to. Take the opportunity to learn and grow in yourself through them. So on to the topic at hand. So why are wetlands important for wildlife? Well, this little guy's a blue-winged teal, and he's surrounded by duckweed, and he's obviously having a good time and full of food that he likes. But that's the question that I want to talk about is what are wetlands and why are they important to wildlife? And as an aside, wetlands provide a lot of valuable benefits to humans as well, right? But I'm going to focus on the wildlife side today. But wetlands provide benefits to us through water storage, through flood control, through water filtration, a variety of other services that we benefit from outside of the world of wildlife. And I could do a whole course on that, but I only have one day here. So, but we're going to focus on wildlife, and a lot of my examples will be birds because that's been most of my specialty. So I'm going to start with what is a wetland. And the key here is that it's always changing. And what defines wetlands is a diversity within their boundaries and a diversity across the landscape of different kinds of wetlands and a diversity over time. So they're constantly changing. And if they don't change, then they will either become a dry land habitat or a lake. And so the idea of change is what makes things a wetland. And so they're sometimes dry and they're sometimes wet. I always chuckle when I drive by a property that has a for sale sign and it looks like a nice dry grassland, but I recognize that the plants are wetland plants, right? So, and 2 years from now, that thing, when it gets into a different cycle, that for sale sign is going to have a foot of water under it. So when you know those things, you have the opportunity to chuckle at those things. But the cycles of wet and dry then can be annual. So they can be wet in the spring and then dry out in the summer, but they can also be over a period of years, where there's years where they're really wet and years where they're dry. And again, they're either not on the lake side, and they're not on the prairie or the dry forest side, but they're somewhere in between. Sometimes they're isolated out on their own, and sometimes they're connected to a river or a lake system. Here's just a graph of a sort of a typical wetland that you would find in a prairie habitat. And what this graph is a graph of the proportion of the wetland that was inundated over time. Okay, and so if you look at that circle, where at the top here, see if I can be dangerous, that circle there. So that year, nearly 100% of this wetland was underwater. But then in these years, it was nearly 100% dry. So those are and then of course there's a lot of years where it's in between. And so those are very drastic differences, but that's what creates and drives the diversity and the productivity of the wetland, is that it's under constant change. So this would be an example of that. If you start down here in a lake that has had water levels up to here for a while, you see that there's this area of open water where there's no emerging vegetation. And then it goes through a dry period, and this area here that was sparsely vegetated, now things spring up. There's seeds that were there that were waiting for a drying out period, and then they sprouted. And then over here, the water comes back, and those plants that grew up are still there. Over a period of time then, if it's a couple of years there and then the water stays, then those are going to deteriorate, and the species of vegetation is going to change, and then it goes through another cycle. And so that's part of what creates the diversity and the productivity of the wetland. This is another way to kind of look at things as a cross section of landscape across from the uplands into the wetlands. And you can see at various distances from the wetland where the water is all the time, and then within the wetland where different plant zones occur. And then you get all the way from an area in here where there's going to be this influence of the wetland, maybe not inundated, but the soil is going to be wet enough that it's going to influence the plant species there. And so they're going to end up still being classified as wetland species because their roots are wet, even if you don't see water on the surface. Into this realm where there's water on the surface and visible, all the way out to where you may not have any vegetation visible because it's deep. This is a photograph I took of a pond, a little wetland right outside my new house. I just moved, and this was kind of cool. I before we bought the place in the summer, I was here, and this was all dry. There was no water in it, but in the spring, I'm assuming it was probably wet after the snow melt. And so what you saw was that it was probably very wet, and then it dried out along this this trough here on the edge down to here. And what you see is these zones of different plants that sprouted and grew at those different stages. So as the water was high and the water came down, this would have been where the soil that got first exposed, but where the water left. And so you see one species that's an early spring sprouter probably came up there. And then the next zone is later in the summer when it gets drier, and then that plant species comes up, and then another one. And so you get these zones and this diversity because of the changing conditions through the wetlands. And each of those different plant species provides something different to the wildlife. And then this is fall when the water came back, and as you can see, I have a nice flock of mallards there that's enjoying what happened, because now that was dry. Those plants grew in, they produced seeds, those seeds were spread, and then the water came back, and then the mallards came in behind it, and then they're going under the water and they're eating all those seeds that were produced by those different species along the way. So I want to talk a little bit about some of those different kinds of plants. So if you do gardening, you know the terms of like annual and perennial. And so an annual plant then is one that grows from a seed each year. And they tend to produce a lot of seeds, right? Because they're going to continue on that species at the location because they're able to produce a bunch of seeds. And so the high seed production means there's a lot of food for the wildlife. So these annual plants are really valuable to wildlife that are looking for high energy seed food. And then sometimes the seeds then are spread, and then they are able to survive in the soil or under the water for a period of time until the conditions get right, and then they germinate. And so here you see we have some wood ducks here, and this is a smartweed. And on these little pretty flowers there, in each one of those little flowers is one of these guys, these little energy packets. And so those are little smartweed seeds, and those birds, they'll either fall off, or when these dry up in the fall, they'll go right along there and they'll strip the whole thing, and they'll eat all those little seeds, and that's great energy for them. So those are annuals, high seed production, a lot of energy food. And then there's perennial emergence. So again, plants that emerge out of the water, but they live for a number of years. They continue year after year. And they tend to prefer more stable water, or at least longer periods of water. Whereas those annuals, they might sprout up in a wetland that only has water on it for a month or two out of the year. Whereas the perennials tend to be on wetlands that have water 9 to 12 months of the year. They invest a lot of their energy in the root system versus the plant, versus the seeds. So they tend to not produce as many seeds. They're producing a lot more roots because, again, they're continuing from year to year. This particular photograph is of a cattail. And as you can see, that it's spreading underground by the root system. So those are new shoots coming up there as it spreads across an area. And those will go underground, or they even go across the water surface sometimes. It's not as much seed value from these species for wildlife, but it's valuable for a lot of the bird species that nest in and around wetlands for nesting habitat. And then other wetland species like muskrats, this is their main food source, for example, the cattails and the roots of that system. And so then they feed on that from the energy. And I did a little, whoops, I'm sorry. I didn't advance the slide. I'm talking about the slide and I didn't advance it. So yell at me when I do something like that, okay? It's okay, just go, hey, you forgot the slide. I need help sometimes, you know, we all need help sometimes. Help me out. And I did a zoom in of the root here of the cattail, and this, you can see right here how thick that is. And one of the neat things about that, if you did a cross section of it, you'd see a lot of air spaces in there, and that's because that root is existing under totally inundated water all the time. And the plant needs gases to move through it in order to survive. And so it has those built-in pockets of air so that it can move across there. And so that also makes it float, which is kind of interesting. And so sometimes you'll see cattail mats floating on top of the water because they have so much airspace in the root system. So then the third type are submergent plants. So these are ones that are living below the water almost all the time. And they're, of course, being in stable water, where most years the water's there all the time. But then there's going to be some years where maybe the wetland dries up. And they, depending on the species, that some are invest in seeds, some invest in roots and tubers. And then both of those are good wildlife food. So like a tuber then is a root that, a specialized kind of root that grows during the summer, and that's what overwinters for the plant. And those are packed with energy. And so some, like canvasback ducks, they're adapted to dive deep, and then they root around in the mud, and they find those tubers and eat them. And they also provide, this is a ceratophyllum, a coontail photo, but as you can see, it has finely dissected leaves, and there's a lot of surface area and a lot of habitat in there for little invertebrates. So these can be very important for the wildlife species that need invertebrates, because this plant may not provide plant food, but it provides habitat for these guys. And wetland invertebrates are yummy protein for a lot of the bird species. And at different times in their life cycle, that's really important. And within this a diverse wetland here, where you have different types of plants at different places in the wetland, each of those different places provides homes for different types of invertebrates. And then the birds that live in those sites feed differently on different types of plants and on different invertebrates. So I talked a little bit there about the diversity within a wetland basin. There's also the diversity of wetlands across the landscape. So this diagram just provides one example of that. And so in this situation, you're going to have different periods of inundation of water, different types of water based upon where the wetland is in the landscape. So here we have mountains that are, where you got snow runoff, and that's coming down. And so in this case, this is a wetland here, and the snow runoff is filling that wetland, and then eventually the wetland's overflowing and it's feeding a river system. Over here, you have another wetland that is isolated. So it's perched on its own in a part of the landscape. It's receiving rainfall and runoff from the mountains, but it's not really overflowing and feeding the river system. Then you have wetlands down here at the lower part of the river, where when the river, all that water comes from the mountains in the spring and fills the river up in the spring, and then the river overflows its banks, then it feeds these wetlands. So in some cases, the wetlands are feeding the river, and then downstream, the river is feeding the wetlands, the water. And then as the river recedes, then those wetlands are left by themselves. So each place in the landscape creates a different type of wetland and a diversity. So I got to live in a situation like that for 3 seasons. This is the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge. So this is kind of a real world photo of what I was just describing on a diagram. Now, this particular photo was taken in the fall, and you can tell because these are all aspen trees turning yellow. But across this landscape, you have some of these larger wetlands that have open water. You have some of these old stream riverways that are no longer. So as the river changes course over time, it isolates and leaves these linear wetlands. And then you see these little ones all here. And as you can see, there's these concentric rings around the wetland that are showing as the wetland filled up, and then the wetland drew down, that there was a diversity of wetlands and plant zones in that wetland. And then across the landscape, then, if you're a wildlife species that needs these different stages and these different types, I got to turn this puppy off. Sorry about that. All right. So this landscape provides these different opportunities, and then the critters, of course, fit into that in different ways. So this is just an example of waterfowl of ducks and geese. And in this case, you have the body form of the wildlife species and the bill shape that are designed to take advantage of those different situations. Here around where we live, you'll see Canada geese, for example, up here in the upland. And Canada geese are actually grazers. They're going to walk around at the edge of wetlands and up in the grass, and they're going to graze just like a cow, and they're going to leave stuff behind just like a cow, which caused me a lot of problems when I worked for the DNR. People would call and complain about goose poop. That was my claim to fame. I made USA Today about an article about goose poop years ago. So you have an exciting future ahead if you go with geese. But anyway, each of these species, then you have the smaller ducks in the shallower water, and then the longer ones, and then the swan that's able to go fairly deep. And swans tend to eat the tubers and the roots because they're long enough to get there. And then you have the canvasback and the redhead ducks that are able to dive down and get the deeper food available that the other birds can't. And then you have the shoveler, who has a specially designed bill right here with lamellae, where they filter out small invertebrates and small plants. If you're familiar, you hear about whales and the baleen whales, and they filter out all the little shrimp. Well, the shoveler duck is doing the same thing. They have the similar thing in their bill to do that. And then the other duck you see there is a wood duck, and they have more of a, like a pincher type, like a pair of pliers to pick things up, because they tend to live in wooded wetlands where they like to eat acorns. So they go and they pick the acorns up, and they even have a little hook on the end of their bill that helps them do that. So you have these diversity of wetlands, and then the animals with diversity of adaptations to fit those. And I talk a lot about ducks because I spent a lot of time, but the shorebirds have a similar thing. Here you have several species of shorebirds, and each one has a different length bill, and some have slightly different curvatures to the bill because they're locating food in their shoreland habitats in different places. The one that goes deeper gets a certain invertebrates out of the soil. The one that goes shallower gets different other ones. So you have a diversity within a wetland. You have a diversity across the landscape that the animals take advantage of. But then within an individual life cycle of a wildlife species, they have different needs and do different things. So here's an example of the mallard. When they're nesting, they need certain types of food and certain types of habitat. When they're raising ducklings, then they need a different type of food and a different type of habitat, and on through the whole cycle. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit, just as an example of how the diversity of the wetlands provides what these animals need throughout their annual life cycle. So we're in the north, and I studied there in Alaska in the north. And so these birds migrate from the south, and they come up to do their breeding. And so one of the first things they have to do is form a pair bond. And the drake and the hen have to form a bond, and they have to go through courtship, and then they mate. And during that period of time, they're looking for small isolated wetlands where they can be alone. So they take we're going to be the romantic couple at the booth. We're not going to go at the bar scene, because what happens at the bar scene? Well, then another guy comes and tries to hit on the hen. And so when the pair is in a larger water body, what happens is those other drakes trying to interfere with the courtship and the breeding. So they're looking for these little wetlands. Now, this particular is like a bog wetland, and they're not all that productive. They don't have a lot of food. They tend to be deep. So they don't have the things that the birds need in those other life cycle periods, but they tend to be isolated. They got spruce trees all around them to kind of screen them off. And so it's a really good place for a pair to develop a pair bond and go through courtship. Then as you move into the summer, nesting is going to become important. And so they're often looking for large areas of at the edge of wetlands or in grasslands to lay their eggs and nest in the grass. A lot of the species of birds that migrate into the northern habitats do this. Some also nest over water. So for example, canvasbacks and redhead ducks they'll pull together vegetation and make their nest with those cattails that tend to float actually on top of the water, and they'll build that up a little bit and then lay their eggs in that. And so what they're doing is they're trying to seek out nesting sites where the predators aren't going to come and eat the eggs. And if you have a very narrow band of grass up next to a wetland, that's an easier path for the predator to walk through and hit all the eggs. If it's wider, it's a lot harder for them to cover the ground and find the nest and the eggs. When I was up in Alaska and I was doing my work, I was sitting in a blind and I was looking through a scope at a wetland doing duck observations, and all of a sudden it went black. You know, you're looking through the scope and all of a sudden it goes black and then it's light again. And I pulled my head back and a wolf had run in front of my scope. And then I watched him, and he was, you know, going back and forth like this through the grass and the edge of the wetland looking for a duck nest. But again, because it was wide enough, he didn't cover all the ground, right? He was moving back and forth. Had it been real narrow, the chances of him flushing any bird that was nesting there would have been greater. So this is an important habitat need they have during that period of time. And then once they start laying eggs and having little guys, then they need a lot of protein. So when that hen, she's producing eggs and laying them, you know, every day. And so she needs a lot of protein intake to be able to produce those eggs. And so that's when they're looking to feed on animal matter rather than plant matter, many of them. And the other thing, of course, is when the young are born, when the little ducklings get out and move around, they've got a lot of growing to do. So they also need protein. And typically what happens for many of these bird species is during that time when they're taking care of the little guys and they're moving about on the landscape, they go ahead and molt, drop the flight feathers that have worn out, right? Because some of these animals are flying from one end of North America all the way down to South America, like blue-winged teal. You know, they'll nest in northern Manitoba and they'll you know winter in Venezuela. So their wings are getting worn out. So they'll grow new ones, and they need a lot of protein during that period of time. And that's what that this photograph here is. These are the new wings growing out, and those what you're seeing there is the sheaths that the feathers are growing in. And if you broke one at that point, it's full of blood. It's really producing a new feather. So they have a different need. And so that's back, remember when I mentioned the submergent aquatic plants providing the habitat for the invertebrates. This is where you're going to see these birds shift where they're at to find the food that they need in that part of the life cycle. And then when fall comes around, they got to hit the road again, and they need a lot of energy. So then they shift back to high energy foods like seeds and tubers. These are canvasback here, and they'll dive deep in that flock there, and the small picture down here, these are canvasback. They'll dive deep and eat tubers off the bottom. And these are a lot of dabbling ducks, mostly mallards, that are in an area that had been plants that got flooded with high seed production. So in a complex like the Yukon River floodplain that I worked in, you have all of these. You have this diversity of wetlands, you have all this different opportunity. And so these animals can move between wetlands and within wetlands and find what they want because there's diversity across the landscape, diversity across the season, and diversity within each wetland basin. So I'm going to jump now from the Arctic Circle to South Florida. And we're going to look at a little bit of a different picture. So I spent 8 years working in South Florida, managing public land and wetlands and in the Everglades. And Florida is an interesting thing. So just to kind of orient you, this would be, Miami would be over here, Orlando would be up here. So the historic flow in that system was these coastal areas are higher. So these are the coastal ridges represented in this diagram. And so Central and South Florida is sort of like a bowl where the coastlines are higher elevation, and then it goes down in the middle, and that's where you find the Kissimmee River, Lake Okeechobee, and the Everglades. And so it's like a giant bowl and a basin there. And so what happens is the rainfall would fall here, and then it moves in this direction slowly. The Everglades, being in this region, is often called the River of Grass because it's a giant marsh, but it has water that's moving through it from north to south. And so in the natural system, the water flows through the Kissimmee Chain of Lakes, Kissimmee River into Lake Okeechobee, and then that had a natural bank. And then when it would get high during the rainy season, it would overflow, and that's what would feed the Everglades water. And then that would continue on. And of course, in Florida, you only have 2 seasons. You know, we have 4 here. It's either wet or it's dry. So basically from, you know, May through September, it rains every day, high humidity. And then starting like October to April, you don't get much rainfall at all. And then of course, also during that summer period, you get hurricanes. So you get a lot of water for 6 months of the year and virtually none the other 6 months of the year. And this shows you a little bit of that sort of bowl shape of a cross section of the landscape. So that's how it should work in the normal landscape. Well, of course, the difference between the Arctic Circle and South Florida is it's warm, and so people want to live there. And people don't like all this change. People don't want their front yard to be dry one day and wet the next. So they want to stabilize everything. So this is the Kissimmee River back when it was more like the Yukon River and had meanders, and it would overflood and fill these wetlands. And this is what it was created in the 1960s, a big giant canal to drain much of central Florida. And it was very deep and very straight. And of course, all the wetlands then on either side were lost. And they became first dairy farms and then ranches, as well as towns. Similarly, within the Everglades proper, they built all of these canals to drain out this central part of the bowl. So this was the natural flow with the coastal ridges, but then the people wanted to move from the coastal ridges and they wanted to move inland. Once the coastal ridges were all full of people, the only place to go, they obviously couldn't go into the Atlantic Ocean, so the only place to go was inland. So they started building these ditches and draining South Florida so that they could build in those areas. And so then it began to restrict the flow of water to a smaller and smaller area. So one of the wildlife species that was impacted in this system is an example. Again, the diversity over time and landscape in the wetlands supports a diverse composition of wildlife. So the wood stork is a species down there that it feeds in shallow water, as you can see in that lower picture. And it feeds, when it's feeding young, it needs its food to be very concentrated. So typically it feeds in the shallow water, puts its head underneath, and then its bill will feel fish or frogs or things like that. And that's what it feeds on. And it does just fine to support itself throughout the year. But when it's nesting, and they nest in colonies up in trees, when it's nesting, different than ducks that take their ducklings out and run around the landscape, these young are sitting in the nest more like your typical yard birds, your passerines, and all the food is brought to them by the parents. So the parents have to be a lot more efficient, and they need a lot more food during the breeding season. So they've timed the breeding cycle with the wet dry cycle of South Florida, so that as the landscape would dry out, then the fish would concentrate in these small pools. So you got this giant marsh of the Everglades, and then as it dries up, particularly those edges of the bowl would dry out first, and there'd be little pockets and little ponds within that giant marsh. Most of the marsh is dry, but these little pockets still have water, and all the fish that lived out in the marsh are concentrating in there. And so that's where the wood storks go, so they can get a whole bunch of food really fast and feed the kids. So here's a aerial photo of that world with a bunch of people in it. So all this white area is the construction, and the coastal ridge probably ends about there. You can see a little bit of a different coloration. So this whole strip in here used to be the edge of the bowl, used to be part of the wetlands of the Everglades. And as the urban areas crept in and drained it, then that became city. So two things happened, a couple things happened. First of all, they put all that water one of two places. They either blocked it off and put it into the inner part of the Everglades, or they put it in a canal and dumped it in the ocean, okay? And so this part where the wood storks would first start to feed to get those declining water levels disappeared. The remaining wetlands out here became deeper because we built a levee and pushed the water inland, or we pushed it out in a canal. And so they lost what the critical piece of what they needed during the wet-dry cycle to support their young, and we began to see nesting decline and population decline from wood stork. Now, interestingly, these areas that we created deeper water, another bird moved in and really liked that deeper water wetland. So that's the snail kite, because in that deeper water, the food they fed on the snails grew in those deeper waters. And so they liked that more stable and deep water. And I arrived in Florida, South Florida in 1990, and the snail kite had really moved in and adapted, and it had declined in other areas. And so during that period of time, we had the wood stork and the overall Everglades ecosystem in decline, except for this one rare bird called the snail kite that found the current situation where we built levees and had deep water behind them, that fit its needs. And so we had this conservation dilemma, because the snail kite is listed federally. So legally, we have to protect it, right? The wood stork at that point in 1990 wasn't federally listed, so there wasn't a law saying, but it was in a rapid decline. So you had these two birds that both needed work, but they were in conflict with each other. And so the wood stork needed that typical wetland variation, and the snail kite liked the more stable part of the cycle. And then, of course, you had this little detail that you got 3.5 million people living there, along with a major winter vegetable industry. And so I was on a water supply planning committee, I remember, representing the critters, and I had, mayors and engineers and all these other people, and we're supposed to figure out how are we going to distribute water between 3.5 million people living from the Florida Keys to Miami to Fort Lauderdale and West Palm Beach, the winter vegetable industry, and the Everglades, right? Talk about a challenge. But what began to develop was another issue. Because we had so changed the landscape, because we had concentrated the water in one spot, dumped some of it, the fresh water, into the ocean, the salt water that surrounds the peninsula of Florida began to creep in to the groundwater. So I lived in Jupiter, Florida. We had 20-some municipal wells, and so they're all drawing groundwater. Half of those municipal wells were drawing brackish water, so water that was partly salty and partly fresh, and then they had to go through a desalinization plant before it came to our tap in our house. So it was beginning to be a problem for people as well. And so we had to come up with a solution, and it was a big problem. And so in the 90s, they began to develop a plan then for a partial restoration of the Kissimmee River and the Everglades. Now, of course, you couldn't restore the whole thing because you got 1 million people living on what used to be wetlands. And of course, now, when I was there 30 years ago, there was 3.5 million people. Now there's 6 million people in South Florida, right? So they even have a greater water supply challenge. And so what they did is the river, originally, they had taken 100 miles of a meandering river that would overflow and fill wetlands, and they channelized it into 50 miles of a big giant ditch. So now I think they've restored about 20 miles, and that's probably about all they'll get. So now we're at like 70 from 100 rather than 50. So they have some of that meander, some of that water storage left in the river. And then they've been working on the Everglades to restore some of the flow. They've removed some of the levees where they could and tried to restore more of a natural cycle. And we've seen a recovery then of the wood stork, because now we've been able to recreate at least some of the habitat they've done. And when I was down there, you know, the engineers and the hydrologists, they were doing lots of studies trying to look at the soil profile and the historic rainfall to understand how things would have worked before we, you know, dammed it and ditched it. And so then they have tried to recreate that in the water regulation cycle to try and mimic as much the normal variation of the system. So that's a system where that the wetland change, the wetland diversity within the basin and across the basin was taken away because we like things to stay the same. That's just how people are. We want everything stable. One of the things I always chuckle about is the people that want to build a big giant home on a beach. Well, why are they there? They're there because there's water and there's sand. Why is there sand? There's sand there because sand moves. And if it was stable, it would grow plants across it, right? And it would become vegetated. But the reason that there's sand there is because it's constantly disturbed. And so then they're surprised when a storm comes in and takes their house away, right? So we try to build stable things in unstable environmental conditions. And that's been the case with wetlands over time, and the reason why we've lost them. And of course, unfortunately, it gets our attention when it starts to affect ourselves, like water coming out of the tap. That's when you start to say, oh, maybe these swamps have some value for things other than ducks. So that's just a snippet of some example of principles of what is a wetland, how it changes, and 2 examples from opposite ends of the continent that I've had experience with. So hopefully that kept almost everybody awake. I lost a couple, but that's okay. That's typical. Occasionally it happens with my sermons, but not often. People watch a lot online now, so you know I don't know if they're sleeping or not. But anyway, any questions? Anything about my history or the presentation, it doesn't matter. The chairs look more comfortable now than they were when I was here. Katie. Ooh, that's a really good question. And I would say almost always. I remember years ago, I had a boss who came out of a different field, and he became the boss over our land management program. And he basically said to me, well, now that we have, you know, this is, you know, 30 years ago, right? So he said, now that we have these GIS capabilities and all this computer programming, can't the computer just tell us how to manage this piece of land? And I said, well, it depends on what your objective is. And he goes, well, can't it just tell us the right thing to do? And I said, no, it can't tell you the right thing to do. You have to identify what is your objective. Because the land can produce 10 different things, but you have to decide which thing it is. And then you manage the water or the fire regime or, you know, the plant cutting or composition. You manage it to produce what you can. Now I told him, I can tell you on certain land, you can't produce something. You know, this is never going to grow here. I can tell you some of the no's, but I said, I can't tell you the right thing to do. You just have to decide what our objective is. So I encountered that all the time. As the wood stork and the snail kite's a good example. Scrub jays and red cockaded woodpeckers in a fire regime is a good one. So the red cockaded woodpeckers in southern pine forests of the United States, they live in areas where you have these pine trees and no vegetation underneath, so that the predators can't get up to their nests in the holes. And that's what it looks like. Very open grass pine trees. Well, so to do that, you have to burn it like every 3 to 5 years. Well, in that soil type, another habitat that often grows is scrub habitat. So it's shrubby, small trees, and that supports this Florida scrub jay. So both of these species are listed. So legally, we're supposed to manage for both of them. But the shrub habitat needs a burning regime of more like 8 to 15 years. So if you have a particular spot where the shrubs grade into the pine trees, you just have to make a decision. Okay, I'm gonna go for red-cockaded woodpeckers from here over and scrub jays from here over. And I had some arguments with the Fish and Wildlife Service biologists when I was down there, the ones that were trying to follow the law about that. And they're like, well, you don't get to decide. And I'm like, somebody's got to decide. Somebody's just got to decide this tract of land is going to be this, because it can't be both. So we did that all the time. And, you know, and sometimes, and again, it's the objective, right? When I'm managing public lands, what's the objective of this particular tract of land? Sometimes that's driven by law. Like we have a funding source that says we're going to buy this land for wildlife areas, this land for state parks, and there's different legal objectives for those. And in other cases, we do a public input plan, and we engage the public and ask them, what do you want this property to be? And then we write a plan to implement what we go in the future. And so different things drive what your objective is.